I'm Henry Schuldiner, an investigator with Inside Crime based in Colombia. Today, I'm going to read a story we published last week. It looks at how organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean has changed in the 5 years since the COVID-19 pandemic began. What shifted back then? And what's still shaping the underworld today? From supply chains being upended to a deepening security crisis in one South American country to organized crime taking advantage of mass migration across the region, the pandemic had far-reaching and lasting effects. This is the full story. 5 years later, how has the pandemic changed organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean? Read by me, Henry Schuldiner. 5 years after the COVID-19 pandemic began, organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean has adopted new strategies and strengthened control over territories and illicit economies. Drug trafficking supply chains have shifted. Criminal syndicates have capitalized on the lack of economic opportunities to recruit new members. And insecurity, combined with economic crises, has sparked a massive wave of migration that criminal groups have exploited to their advantage. Inside Crime analyzes several ways the pandemic has impacted organized crime since it began 5 years ago. 1. Reshaped drug trafficking routes and supply chains. In March 2020, the United States, Canada, and Mexico closed their borders to all non-essential travel, claiming it was a necessary measure to curb the spread of COVID-19. For criminal groups involved in drug and arms trafficking, the border closures further disrupted the global supply chains that sustain the drug trade. In Mexico, synthetic drug producers had long relied on chemicals imported from Asia to manufacture drugs like fentanyl and methamphetamine. But as these imports slowed, Mexican producers had to adapt. Instead of relying on key precursor chemicals like P2P and methylamine, they began synthesizing these compounds from more readily available and loosely regulated chemicals sourced domestically. This shift not only shielded fentanyl producers from the tightening global controls on chemical imports, but also made their operations more resilient to disruptions in international supply chains. In Colombia, the pandemic's border closures and reduced maritime traffic presented drug trafficking organizations with the opposite problem: too much product. Delays and rising costs in the maritime shipping industry created a bottleneck in Colombia, leaving traffickers with stockpiles of drugs ready to be shipped. With more cocaine than they could move, criminal groups splintered and competition intensified. As the world emerged from the pandemic and demand picked up, drug traffickers seeking to reach Europe or the United States had their pick of Colombian criminal groups to work with, often favoring those with the strongest logistics networks, territorial control, and access to trafficking routes. This struggle for dominance sparked violent clashes along key corridors, deepening fractures within Colombia's underworld. The ripple effects of this power struggle are still visible today in conflict zones. 2. Accelerated Ecuador's security crisis. Few countries in Latin America felt the long-term security consequences of the pandemic as acutely as Ecuador. As nationwide lockdowns took effect, Ecuador's economy ground to a halt. Mobility restrictions shuttered businesses and unemployment skyrocketed, according to the Ecuadorian Observatory of Organized Crime. Criminal organizations wasted no time and stepped into the vacuum left by the state, recruiting minors and unemployed youth with the offer of reliable income as social programs were slashed and government assistance dwindled. The surge in the murder of young people paints a grim picture of Ecuador today. Since 2020, the murder of individuals 19 and younger has risen by more than 200%. When security forces shifted their focus to enforcing lockdowns and social distancing measures, anti-narcotics operations such as drug seizures, preventative raids, and intelligence gathering plummeted. Organized crime seized this opportunity as police priorities changed. At the same time, already overcrowded and unstable prisons were deprioritized, with resources redirected elsewhere. criminal groups took to strengthening their grip behind bars and using the penitentiary system as a breeding ground for recruitment, coordination, and power consolidation. The consequences of this neglect are still playing out today, as Ecuador's prisons remain epicenters of violence and criminal control. 3. Solidified criminal control over migrant smuggling. Emigration from some of Latin America's most insecure and economically distressed countries surged during the pandemic. Initially, this human mobilization was hindered by lockdowns and land border closures, particularly between Venezuela and Colombia. As official channels tightened, migrants were forced into the hands of smugglers, particularly Tren de Aragua. The group began offering multi-leg, multi-country smuggling packages. Even as borders reopened, many migrants continued to rely on smugglers like Tren de Aragua, viewing migration officials and security forces in Venezuela as corrupt and untrustworthy. In Colombia, the number of people crossing the Darien Gap, the jungle that connects Colombia and Panama, exploded after the pandemic. The Gaitanes Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AGC for their Spanish acronym, the dominant criminal group in northern Colombia, dramatically expanded their role in the migrant smuggling business as the volume of migrants surged. In 2021, around 130,000 individuals made the journey. By 2024, that figure had skyrocketed to over 500,000. The unprecedented flow of migrants through the Darien Gap became a significant issue not only for local criminal groups, but for international politics. By 2024, migration had become one of the most pressing issues in the U.S. presidential campaign, as thousands of migrants, many heading for the United States, traversed this dangerous jungle corridor, largely facilitated by organized crime. While migration through the Darien has significantly tapered off in 2025, the AGC used this crisis to strengthen its grip on the Urubá region in northern Colombia, home to the Darien Gap. In North America, the pandemic's impact on border policies and migrant smuggling remains evident today. When COVID-19 hit, the United States implemented Title 42, a public health measure that effectively suspended asylum procedures and gave officials the authority to expel migrants back to Mexico or their home countries. But Title 42 often drove migrants into the hands of organized crime groups offering smuggling services, who saw the influx of vulnerable people as an opportunity for extortion, kidnapping, and sexual assault. And as many migrant shelters were forced to close or limit their capacity, people became more exposed to the dangers of the criminal underworld. Mexican criminal organizations, including the Northeast Cartel, an offshoot of the Zetas, intensified their control over migrant routes. In border cities like Nuevo Laredo, the group escalated kidnappings and demanded ransoms that could reach thousands of dollars for release. The exploitation of these migrants, who were told to remain in Mexico due to pandemic-era border closures, significantly boosted the profits of Mexico's criminal groups and their reliance on migrant smuggling as a key part of their criminal portfolio. This was 5 years later. How has the pandemic changed organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean? A story from Insight Crimes News Desk. Published April 8th, 2025. Written by me, Henry Schuldener. For more audio stories, podcasts, and long-form narrative journalism, be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, and YouTube. And to read more of our coverage on organized crime in the Americas, go to insightcrime.org.